with us. We thank you for that. 44,000 hours of security tapes from January 6th, all in the hands of Fox News. So why do they have it, but the other networks don't, including this one? And are there security concerns with the release of these tapes in the first place? I'm going to ask Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren that very question, plus her thoughts on the DOJ's pressure campaign on former Vice President Mike Pence. Also, the Biden administration is responding to reports that China is weighing whether to provide Russia with lethal aid to bolster their presence in Ukraine. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made the rounds on the morning shows. Here's what he had to say.
Their weapons would, in effect, be used for the slaughter of people in Ukraine. So I think it would be ill-advised for China to move forward.
And you know the old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case, it's a lot more. I'm going to speak with a New York Times photojournalist about the raw and unfiltered pictures, I should say, that she's taken in Ukraine, and why it tells a story that brings the reader closer to war than anything else. And nearly 6 months after the death of Mahsa Amini, the women of Iran are not backing down in their efforts to gain rights and dignity that they have long deserved. Coming up, I'm going to speak with two activists about the ongoing defiance still being seen to this day by millions of Iranian women. And then later on this hour, failing to comply. Why so many hospitals around the country are not following a new federal law forcing companies to be transparent about charges that patients are receiving. We begin this hour, though, with the shocking release of sensitive footage from January 6th to Fox News host Tucker Carlson. Top Democrats are speaking out about just how dangerous this is. Here's Congresswoman Madeleine Dean earlier on MSNBC.
It is revealing of where the Capitol Police are and different staging, what was going on. It would give access to bad actors to try to do it again. So it's extraordinarily irresponsible, and how irresponsible of the Speaker of the House to live up to some campaign promise to the far right and to Tucker Carlson to release the tapes.
And she's not the only one speaking out. Former members of the January 6th House Committee are raising alarms as well, including my next guest, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, Democrat of California, who joins me now. Congresswoman, as always, it is a pleasure to talk to you. We know this was a negotiation that the House Speaker had with specifically Matt Gaetz. This was an ask that Matt Gaetz had in releasing these 40,000 hours of tape. Your reaction to this was it's really a roadmap to people who might want to attack the Capitol again. It would be of huge assistance to them. How worried are you now that these tapes are in the hands of Tucker Carlson at Fox News and they've been released?
Well, I have a concern, as I mentioned earlier. There are things in the tapes that we did not release at the request of the Capitol Police. Because they would endanger the security of the Capitol. If Carlson has been given, as he described, unfettered access and is prepared to use the material without regard to the security issues, that would be a problem. I mean, we obviously January 6th were Trump supporters trying to overturn the government, but we have threats from international terrorism as well. I think ISIS would love to know where the cameras are located and where the gaps are.
NBC, MSNBC as well, our network, has also requested these tapes now that Fox News has it in their hands. Considering these security concerns that you, along with so many of your other colleagues, have, do you think they should be released to other networks beyond Fox News?
Well, I can understand why other networks are asking, because it was obviously unfair and unreasonable for the Speaker to gain access only to one allegedly news agency. On the other hand, the security issues remain. I mean, it's not as if the January 6th committee withheld important elements of the video. I mean, we did not, however, release the video of the Speaker's lobby as the mob tried to break in, because security for the officers, but also the members were being, including me, were being evacuated at the other end of the hallway, not a very big room. So there, but you know, what we delivered to the American people is a fair representation of what happened. Now, I think a lot of us believe that Carlson will selectively edit to try and present a false narrative. He has been delivering a false narrative about January 6th throughout. But providing sensitive material to others would not solve that problem.
It seems like the negotiations that Speaker McCarthy had with members of the right wing of his party are beginning to trickle out. Have you had conversations? Do you know what is in the pipeline when it comes to what he has said he will do for the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Matt Gaetzes and the Lauren Boeberts of the world in order to secure the votes that he needed to become Speaker?
No, we don't know what he promised his right wing. And Matt Gaetz has not told me. So I have a concern. If this is an example of the kind of promises he made that could endanger the security of the United States, then yes, there's a concern. But we honestly don't know. I was there for the 15 votes. It seemed like an endless loop. And towards the end, he seemed desperate to do anything, promise anything to get the votes. Who knows what he promised?
Let's talk about the special counsel investigation, if we can, Congressman. I'm talking specifically, of course, about the subpoena delivered to the former vice president of the United States, which he is fighting so far. Jack Smith has compelled a judge or has asked a judge to step in to compel the vice president, the former vice president, to testify. Also now subpoenaing Ivanka Trump along with her husband, Jared Kushner, as well. Your committee heard from both Ivanka and Jared, however, did not hear from the former vice president because he did not offer up his testimony. He refused to appear before the J6 committee. How important is it for Jack Smith to hear from the former vice president of the United States? And what would you like to learn from him, if you can share?
Well, I think it is important. His assertion that he has protection under the speech or debate clause is pretty weird. The Constitution does provide that the vice president serves as the president of the Senate. And of course, the 12th Amendment has the president of the Senate opening the envelope so they shall then be counted. But even if you assume serving as president of the Senate somehow makes him a legislative branch officer, which I think is quite a stretch. Opening the envelopes and reading the results is not a legislative act. So this ploy is not going to work in my judgment, and he will testify. And I'd like to know some of the things that we were unable to get. There was a discussion between him and the then president on the morning of the 6th. He left the room, and the other people who were there don't know what was said by the president. He had conversations with Mr. Eastman, who took the Fifth Amendment all day and wouldn't testify to us. There's a lot of information that only the vice president could provide. And I think he ought to do the right thing. Just go in and testify, not go through this kind of crazy charade, trying to pretend he's a member of the Senate.
Congressman, before I let you go, I just want you to weigh in on former Mayor of San Jose, Sam Liccardo, who told you that he may run for your seat. And here's what you had to say about it. Quote, Liccardo said he was assessing his options. He wants to be in Congress. And I told him it's a free country. He can run if he wants. But I plan to run, and I don't usually run to lose. You at all worried?
No, I'm not worried. Every other year we have an election, and it's a real hire decision on the part of the voters. So I take nothing for granted. I intend to reach out to voters. I'm proud of the things I've done, especially my service on the January 6th committee and my defense of the Constitution. And I'm hopeful that the voters of this district will recognize that.
Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, as always,